In just 7 explosive minutes, Judge Edward Chen went from mocking Senator J.D. Vance in open court to hearing the 4 words no one ever expects to hear in their own courtroom: "You're under arrest." The gavel had barely cooled. Cameras were still rolling. And the tension in that federal courtroom? You could cut it with a knife. What unfolded that day wasn't just a legal twist. It was a collapse of reputation, power, and pride, all within a matter of hours. One man believed he stood above accountability. The other walked in prepared to challenge everything that system protected. Now let's be clear. This isn't news footage. You won't find it on the evening broadcast. But like many stories we hold close, it's a reflection of truths too sharp to ignore. This is a dramatization shaped with care to capture something deeper than headlines. The emotions, the tensions, the reckoning that so many Americans feel, but rarely see named. Because sometimes a fictional courtroom can say what the real ones won't, and sometimes imagined moments bring us closer to reality than any official transcript ever could. So ask yourself, what did J.D. Vance say behind closed doors that made a sitting judge lose everything before the sun even set? Don't blink. Every moment ahead carries the weight of truth, pride, and one final, irreversible mistake. Downtown Miami wakes up slow, but the courthouse never sleeps. The federal courthouse on North Miami Avenue doesn't shimmer like new justice. It broods, tall, pale, and silent like a stone sentinel. Its cold marble exterior seems carved not to welcome, but to judge. Beneath the overcast sky, the humidity sticks like a warning. Inside, everything gleams: polished marble floors that mirror nervous footsteps, fluorescent lights that don't blink, and security guards with eyes like scanners. The scent in the air is a strange blend of lemon-scented disinfectant and wet concrete, a silent reminder that power sweats too. At precisely 7:58 a.m., the metal detectors groan as J.D. Vance steps through. He's not here as the junior senator from Ohio. He carries no entourage. No cameras trail him. His tie is charcoal gray, knotted with intention. His face is unreadable. But something in the way he moves says, he's not here to speak. He's here to expose. "Special counsel Vance?" the clerk asked without looking up, already motioning toward courtroom 4B. He nods. That's right. The hallway stretches long and silent. Each step echoes off stone, sharp, deliberate. The courthouse doesn't blink, but it listens. Behind the double oak doors, Judge Edward Chen is already seated. He didn't rise when J.D. entered. He barely looked up. Chen's reputation precedes him: decorated, intellectual, and, as the whispers go, untouchable. From beneath the heavy robes, his expression flickers with condescension. He taps his pen against the bench as if waiting for someone more important. Someone who matters. "Senator," Chen finally says, drawing out the title like an inconvenience. "Or shall I call you counselor today?" "Counselor will do," J.D. replies calmly, not a trace of offense in his voice. But in his mind, a different dialogue unfolds. He's not here to win. He's here to expose rot, quietly, precisely, completely. The case, United States versus Becker, seems straightforward on the docket, a civil rights violation buried in bureaucracy. But J.D. knows better. Buried under the legal jargon is a tangle of police misconduct, falsified evidence, and missing surveillance tapes that somehow all vanished under Judge Chen's watch. And that's why this moment matters. J.D.'s hand hovers over the leather folder he brought in, not filled with arguments, but evidence. Whispers turned into affidavits, fear translated into fact. Across the courtroom, attorneys glance his way, curious, some wary. Most of them didn't expect J.D. Vance to show up. Certainly not here, certainly not like this, and especially not against Judge Edward Chen. The judge leans back, fingers steepled. "This court doesn't entertain theatrics, counselor." "I hope you came with more than political ambition." J.D. meets his eyes. "I came with truth. Let's see how long it lasts in this room." A hush settles. Not outside. The streets of Miami still hum with life. But here, inside courtroom 4B, truth just stepped into a place where it's not always welcome. The quiet didn't last. No sooner had J.D. opened his folder than Judge Edward Chen leaned forward, voice cutting the room like a blade disguised in velvet. "We've reviewed your initial motion, counselor," he began, eyes flicking toward the bench with performative fatigue. "And frankly, I've seen more coherent arguments from first-year law students." A ripple of discomfort moved through the courtroom. JD didn't flinch. Instead, he uncapped a pen, gently flattened a yellow legal pad on the desk before him, and began to write, slowly, deliberately, like a man taking inventory, not offense. Chen wasn't finished. "I do hope your next remarks bring more substance than sentiment. This court does not run on emotion, no matter how stirring your press conferences might be." It wasn't the words, but the tone that made heads turn. Reporters lifted their eyes from their laptops. A court clerk, mid-scribble, paused. Even the bailiff stiffened slightly, as if unsure whether to brace for thunder or thunderclap. JD lifted his gaze briefly, not to respond, just to see. He let the moment hang, then returned to his notes, his face unreadable, but his silence louder than Chen's jab. The judge smirked, then waved a hand. "Proceed." JD rose, but he didn't retaliate. He didn't match arrogance with anger. Instead, his voice was calm, measured, surgical. "In this matter," he began, "we contend that the procedural irregularities in the Becker case, specifically the redacted tapes, unlogged evidence transfers, and suppressed testimonies, point not to negligence, but to a sustained pattern of obstruction within the judicial process itself." Before he could continue, Chen cut in again. "Let me stop you right there. Are you implying this court has been complicit in obstruction?" JD didn't blink. "I'm implying the system, Your Honor, has patterns that deserve review, and I intend to show those patterns clearly." A hush fell again, but beneath that silence was something new, a shift. In the gallery, some leaned in. Others exchanged quiet glances. The tension wasn't just legal, it was personal, and people could feel it. What they didn't know was that J.D. Vance had not walked into this courtroom cold. Flashback. Just 5 nights earlier, in a dim conference room in Dayton, J.D. had sat across from 3 men, each wrongfully imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. One had served 12 years, another 18. The third, he'd just buried his mother the week before, in shackles under guard. They had names, but the system never used them. They had cried, but not when recounting the beatings or the solitary cells. They cried when asked what it felt like to be forgotten. J.D. had recorded every word. He'd carried their voices in his pocket since, and now, standing before a judge who saw his presence as a political stunt, J.D. knew one thing with diamond clarity. This wasn't about him. Judge Chen may have believed he was cornering an ambitious senator, but what he didn't realize, what the gallery was beginning to sense, was that J.D. hadn't come to perform. He had come to confront. And confrontation, when wielded with truth, doesn't shout. It sharpens. Chen adjusted his robe, suddenly aware of how quiet the courtroom had become. Perhaps he thought his sarcasm would rattle J.D. Perhaps he thought belittling him would reclaim control of the narrative. But J.D. Vance didn't take the bait. He made a note, then another. And when he finally looked back up, his expression was not defiant, but patient, like a man watching someone dig their own grave, one insult at a time. And so the first cuts from the bench had been made, but they didn't wound J.D. They exposed the trembling hand behind the gavel. The courtroom had begun to lean in, not literally but atmospherically. There was a scent of shift in the air, like the room itself understood something beneath the surface was beginning to crack. Judge Edward Chen, however, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did, and that was the problem. J.D. Vance had just concluded his preliminary framework. It wasn't fire and brimstone, but methodical. Timelines, inconsistencies, patterns of sealed evidence that shouldn't have been sealed. And he had delivered it all with the poise of a man who wasn't seeking applause, just truth. That poise, it seemed, irritated the judge. Chen leaned back slowly in his chair, fingers templed, lips drawn into a razor's edge of a smile. "Stick to politics, Vance," he said, loud enough to echo. "Leave the law to the grown-ups." It was a line meant to humiliate, not in content, but in delivery. The kind of line designed not just to undercut a man's arguments, but to reduce his legitimacy entirely. A calculated, casual cruelty spoken from a bench that had grown too comfortable with power. And yet, JD didn't flinch, not even a blink. Instead, he calmly placed his pen on the legal pad and met Chen's eyes with something not often seen in courtrooms where power usually flows one way: clarity. He stood, straightened his jacket, and then, no anger, no theatrics, he spoke. "This court," JD said evenly, "belongs to the people, not the person wearing the robe." The room didn't gasp. It froze. Not because the words were loud, but because they cut deeper than anything shouted. It wasn't defiance. It was a quiet correction. And somehow in that single sentence, the marble and oak around them felt less like a stage and more like a mirror. From the far back row, a woman who hadn't moved much all morning finally lifted her pen. She was seated alone, a gray suit, no badge on display. Her presence was quiet but deliberate. She tilted her head slightly, then scribbled something into a slim leather folio. DOJ, Internal Affairs. She hadn't come to chase headlines. She had come to listen. And now, for the first time, she was interested. At that exact moment, as JD returned to his seat and opened his folder again, a second folder appeared, quietly and without announcement. It slid across the table as if guided by the courtroom wind. No name, no label, just a manila seal with red trim and 3 words: surveillance package #1. JD didn't reach for it immediately. He knew better. Instead, he scanned the room with his peripheral vision, calculating angles, faces, movement. It had come from the assistant counsel's table, one of the aides with federal clearance. A subtle nod was exchanged, almost imperceptible. Inside that folder would be the first concrete lead, the kind that doesn't get mailed, doesn't get archived, and definitely doesn't get leaked. Only one way something like that made it onto JD's table in open court. Someone inside had changed sides. Judge Chen didn't notice. He was too busy reasserting his authority, too smug in the illusion of control. But the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The earlier insults had sounded like dominance. Now they echoed like desperation. The silent woman in the back flipped to a fresh page and wrote just 3 words: "Monitor Chen closely." The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. What happened next wouldn't be loud. It would be systematic, surgical, inevitable. JD Vance picked up his pen again, but this time he wasn't taking notes. He was marking the first turn in a trial that had just outgrown the judge pretending to oversee it. It didn't take long for the courtroom to shift again, this time not in silence but in symmetry. What had started as subtle imbalance was now on full display. If the law was supposed to be blind, Judge Edward Chen had made it blink. Repeatedly. JD Vance stood, documents in hand, prepared to introduce the first wave of evidence. Sworn affidavits, timelines, forensic inconsistencies that any impartial bench would welcome. But before the exhibit tags could even be cited, Chen cut in. "Motion denied," he said, almost bored. "Irrelevant foundation." JD didn't flinch. He adjusted his approach, narrowing the context, reframing the intent. "Your Honor, this document directly rebuts the state's timeline." "Still denied." The interruption came faster this time, sharper, more dismissive, and louder. Across the room, the opposing counsel rose with a mild smirk, clearly emboldened. When he presented his own set of records, some borderline speculative, Chen not only allowed them, but encouraged elaboration. "Counselor, take your time," the judge said. "This court values transparency." That was the second crack. The first had been the insult. But now it was unmistakable. The gavel wasn't weighing fairness. It was leaning toward protection. And the jurors felt it. They had been still earlier, respectful, eyes forward. But now there was a different energy. Twitches of discomfort, glances exchanged beneath furrowed brows. No one said it aloud, but the air whispered the truth. Something's off. JD returned to his seat momentarily, flipping open the folder marked Surveillance Package #1, just enough to scan a line of text under a redacted header. His brow barely moved, but his spine straightened. He didn't need to see the whole file. The first paragraph was enough to confirm it. The rot went deeper than he'd hoped and wider than he'd feared. But this wasn't the time to reveal it. Not yet. Timing was everything. Judge Chen was playing a short game of obstruction. JD had come to play a long game of transformation. He leaned slightly toward his junior counsel and whispered, "We're not here to win this round. We're here to show the world why the rules are rigged." And then he stood again. This time he didn't present a document. He asked a simple question about chain of custody, one the court record already included. But even then, Chen's hand came up like a signal flag. "Objection," asked and answered. "That wasn't an objection," JD responded calmly. "That was a statement, and you made it." The courtroom didn't laugh. It held its breath. This was a slow chess match disguised as a trial, and JD wasn't trying to checkmate Edward Chen. He was trying to pull the board out from under him and make everyone see the strings. The DOJ official in the back scribbled another note. One juror glanced her way, then looked back at JD, eyes beginning to open. Not fully, but enough. When JD finally returned to his seat, a low hum of whispered reactions moved through the rows behind him. A court reporter paused to sip water, then resumed typing with slightly wider eyes. Even a bailiff shifted his posture. Edward Chen tried to maintain his posture of control, but the more he shut down reason, the more visible his bias became. And as JD calmly arranged his next folder, Exhibit 12B, Patterns of Sealed Testimony, he said more to himself than to the room, "The goal is not to beat him at his game, it's to change the game entirely." And with that, the battle moved forward, not toward verdict, but toward exposure. If the courtroom had once resembled a battleground of ideas, by late afternoon, it had morphed into something more disturbing, a stage where the illusion of justice took center spotlight. And Judge Edward Chen, he played the lead role with flair and venom. "Counselor Vance," he said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from every corner of the room, "I suggest you brush up on Wells v. United States before trying to apply its logic here. It's a common error among amateurs." JD didn't react. Not with his face, anyway. Only his hand moved, scribbling a note on his yellow legal pad, the same pad that by now was a mosaic of calm resistance. Arrows, fragments, questions that weren't meant to be asked in court, but in history. The real problem wasn't that Chen referenced the case. It was that he intentionally misquoted it. JD knew the ruling by heart. Chen had flipped the burden of proof in his retelling, a quiet distortion that wouldn't register to most ears but would completely tilt the framework for the jury if left unchecked. And still, JD let it pass. For now, because timing, again, was everything. In the back row, the DOJ observer, unassuming in her posture, deliberate in her stillness, didn't flinch either. But her hand slipped inside her blazer and retrieved a slim phone. With barely a twitch of her brow, she tapped in a silent number. The call connected. No words were spoken, just a soft breath, and then the call was ended. The message had been sent. Outside, beneath the marble arch that greeted all who entered the courthouse, 3 men appeared. No uniforms, no visible badges, no movement to suggest urgency. But they didn't come for a trial. They came for a man, and they waited. Back inside, Chen wasn't done performing. "So, Mr. Vance," he continued with exaggerated politeness, "when you argue constitutional overreach, are you suggesting this court should disregard its own precedents? Or simply that you don't understand them?" A few in the gallery chuckled nervously. It was the kind of mockery that teetered between academic insult and institutional humiliation. JD looked up now, finally, and his voice, when it came, was smooth as silk cut with steel. "Your Honor, I believe courts are bound to follow not only precedent, but truth within precedent. A misread decision helps no one, least of all the people this bench was built to serve." For a heartbeat, the silence in the room felt like a vacuum. You could almost hear the ink drying on the DOJ observer's next note. Chen scoffed. "Save the sermon, Senator. This isn't Capitol Hill." JD didn't respond. Instead, his eyes flicked briefly to the sealed folder that had earlier appeared on his desk. It now rested beneath a legal brief, untouched by anyone else. But its presence was a whisper louder than words. In the jury box, a woman in a blue cardigan, juror #6, glanced at JD, then at the judge. Something in her eyes shifted, a crack of doubt, a moment of mental note-taking. These were not neutral eyes anymore. And still the performance went on. Chen leaned back in his chair with theatrical fatigue. Counselor, if this is the extent of your federal literacy, I'm beginning to wonder if this case is a waste of the court's time. J.D. Vance gave a quiet smile. Not of surrender, but of strategy. Because what Judge Chen didn't realize was that the story unfolding wasn't about his courtroom anymore. It was about what waited beyond it. And just outside its walls, 3 plainclothes agents checked their watches. One of them nodded. Not yet, but soon. The courtroom had emptied into a murmur of footsteps and half-finished thoughts as recess was called. J.D. remained seated, hands folded on his legal pad, as if still mid-cross-examination. Across the room, Judge Chen vanished through the judge's entrance, like a fading actor between acts. Still unaware the curtain behind him had begun to fray. His co-counsel, a younger attorney named Mark Lopez, moved quickly but without panic. He slid onto the bench beside J.D., glanced once around, and reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Without a word, he pulled out a small silver USB drive and laid it on the table, right atop J.D.'s handwritten notes. It came through the secure Dropbox 10 minutes ago, Mark murmured, triple verified. J.D. didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he stared at the glint of metal, like a spark from a long-hidden fuse. What's inside? He asked, voice low. Mark's tone was dry but shaken. Emails, direct messages, all from a private server. Judge Chen, communicating with Generalis Defense Holdings. J.D.'s brow tightened. That was the name. The same corporation whose subcontractor had been accused of falsifying detainment logs. The same corporation whose political donations traced back to PACs that quietly influenced appointments. And now the same corporation the judge had pretended to rule against with reluctant objectivity. J.D. finally picked up the USB. It felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just evidence, but consequence. How bad is it? He asked. Mark swallowed. Let's put it this way. One of the emails includes the sentence, I can't guarantee a favorable ruling unless they back off the subpoenas. J.D.'s fingers tapped once on the yellow pad, twice, then stopped. His voice was a whisper meant for one set of ears. His assistant, seated 2 chairs away. The gavel drops tonight. The words sent a chill not through her spine, but through the story that was unfolding, minute by minute. She didn't respond. She only reached for her laptop. Across the courtroom gallery, the DOJ observer hadn't left. She remained seated, flipping through her own notes, checking the clock. There was no phone in her hand now, no gestures, but her eyes were fixed on J.D., watching, waiting, measuring what he would do next. Because this was no longer just a question of courtroom protocol, it was a question of exposure. J.D. leaned back, lifting the USB just slightly, staring at it as if it might reveal its contents on contact. In truth, he already knew what it contained. Not just corruption, but motive. Not just communication, but collusion. And not just favoritism, but judicial compromise at the federal level. He stood slowly. Recess had 5 minutes left, but his steps took him to a small alcove just off the main courtroom, the attorney's lounge. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights met the soft whir of an outdated computer. J.D. inserted the USB, waited for the folder to load, and opened the first email. There it was, a timestamp, a sender, a subject line. Suppress Vance evidence, will handle from bench. His jaw set. This wasn't about J.D. anymore. It wasn't even about the case. It was about the people Chen had silently injured, one ruling at a time. About the victims J.D. had met, whose lives had unraveled behind bars they should have never seen. About every whistle J.D. had blown and every door that had slammed in response. Now the doors were opening again, but not with welcome, with consequence. Outside, agents were moving. Inside, the chessboard was rearranging itself in real time. And J.D. Vance, calm, deliberate, sharpened by purpose, was already preparing the move that would make the entire system blink. When the court reconvened, something in the air had shifted, so slight it escaped most, yet undeniable to those attuned to power. J.D. Vance walked back to the counsel's table with measured calm. The courtroom still unaware of the files resting securely in his inner pocket, watched him take his seat as though he had never left it. But his presence had changed. The quiet fire behind his eyes was no longer theoretical. It had been fed. Judge Chen re-entered moments later, adjusting his robe with the arrogance of a man who believed the room still bent in his direction. He barely glanced at JD. The bailiff called for order. The next phase had begun. JD rose deliberately, his voice firm yet composed, as if each word had been weighted in advance. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to revisit one point raised earlier, he began, eyes not flickering, specifically with regard to Judicial Canon 2A, concerning the necessity of preserving public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary. The room stilled. That wasn't the kind of language a litigator casually lobbed mid-trial, especially not in front of a sitting federal judge. But JD said it evenly, without venom, like an observation from a textbook everyone had forgotten to read. Chen leaned forward, his lips curled into the kind of smirk that hadn't met resistance in decades. "Oh, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dripping derision, "are you accusing me of something? That's a rather dangerous tone for a man barely wearing the robe of legal practice." JD didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. "No accusations, Your Honor. Merely documentation. We'll let the record speak for itself." The phrase hit like a scalpel, too clean to be called a threat, but too sharp to be dismissed. Reporters in the back straightened. Clerks looked at each other. Even the court reporter paused before resuming her rapid clicks. It wasn't just what JD had said, it was the certainty in how he said it, like someone already holding the last card. Chen chuckled, but the laughter didn't quite land. He shifted in his chair. "Very well, counselor. Proceed with your next witness, unless you plan to recite more of the judicial handbook?" JD nodded once, returned to the table, and whispered briefly to Mark. From the other side of the gallery, the DOJ observer now leaned slightly forward. Her posture was professional. Her eyes were surgical. JD turned back to the court. "Before we continue, I'd like to enter 3 items into the record," he said. "Exhibit Group Delta. I'll reserve foundation until after review." The judge barely looked. "Noted. Move on." But JD wasn't moving on. He was digging in, slowly, carefully, strategically. What Chen didn't yet realize, what few in the courtroom had grasped, was that JD wasn't here to win a verdict. He was here to open a window, to let the light in on everything that had festered behind closed doors, inside chambers, beneath gavels that had long ago lost their sound of justice. And even as Chen returned to his routine, mocking tones, dismissive gestures, his grip was weakening. Because JD Vance wasn't fighting him anymore. He was exposing him. The next morning, the courtroom lights seemed just a little harsher, the air thicker. Even those who considered themselves seasoned court watchers found themselves shifting in their seats with a tension they couldn't quite name. Something was happening just beneath the surface. JD Vance stood with the same quiet authority as before, but this time there was something in his hand, a thick black binder, plainly labeled Judicial Activity Log. Annotated. No theatrics, no raised voice. Just the confident click of the binder being placed on the evidence table. His voice was calm, surgical. "Your Honor, I am submitting this binder as Exhibit Delta 1. It contains a documented timeline of your rulings over the past 6 years, correlated with financial transactions linked to an entity previously sealed in this court's docket." The courtroom went still, not a cough, not even the shuffle of paper. A single second passed, then another. JD let the silence expand, let the room hear itself. Then he continued. Each ruling, each docket entry, cross-referenced against financial records from Greylock Construction Services and its subsidiaries. Judge Chen's pen, which had been resting lightly in his hand, slipped slightly against the paper. He looked down too quickly and tried to recover, clearing his throat. The color in his face shifted, almost imperceptibly, but JD saw it. So did the woman from the DOJ, now sitting with both feet flat, hands folded in front of her, watching like a hawk mid-dive. Chen tried to inject authority back into the moment. This is nothing more than political posturing," he barked. "We're here to try a civil matter, not stage a Senate confirmation hearing." But the voice that once silenced rooms now felt thinner. JD didn't look away. He gently turned the binder around and opened to the first page. On it, a single date, March 3rd, 2020. A minor zoning dispute in Tampa. Chen's ruling favored a mid-tier construction firm. Within 48 hours, a PSC linked to that firm donated $50,000 to a now-defunct political committee, one with quiet but traceable ties to Chen's longtime advisor. Your Honor, JD said still evenly, the binder includes certified wire transfers, meeting transcripts, and internal communications. Each entry includes the corresponding docket decision and timestamp movement of funds. Chen stood up slightly from his chair. This is outrageous. And yet, JD interjected softly, entirely admissible. From the gallery, gasps rippled as three individuals in tailored gray suits stood up in near-perfect unison. No badges, no announcement. But the courtroom recognized them. FBI agents, no longer waiting in the wings. Present, visible, watching. Chen hesitated for half a breath, his mouth still open, unsure whether to finish his outburst or retreat into silence. I assure the court, JD continued, this isn't political. This is procedural. This is what happens when the record is allowed to speak for itself. The judge looked down again, hands clasped in front of him now, knuckles white against the polished oak bench. His gavel lay untouched. He didn't even glance at it. Across the room, jurors shifted again, but this time not from discomfort, from awareness. This wasn't just another trial. This was something else, something bigger. And as JD closed the binder with a soft but resounding thud, the gallery knew. The gavel hadn't dropped yet, but the gravity had shifted. The balance of the courtroom, the balance of power, was no longer in the judge's hands. The silence that followed the binder's closing wasn't peaceful. It was charged. A silence that held its breath, not out of respect, but anticipation. Somewhere in the back row, the DOJ official rose slowly, as though she had been waiting for precisely this threshold to be crossed. She didn't speak loudly. She didn't need to. Your Honor, she said, her voice measured but unmistakably firm, on behalf of the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility, I am formally notifying this court that a judicial integrity investigation is being opened into the proceedings and conduct associated with this bench. Every word landed like a hammer, not loud but final. A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery, then through the press pool. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but pens scribbled at a frantic pace. Fingers trembled over courtroom sketches that suddenly had real consequences. The front row of interns all leaned forward in unison, like wheat bowing to the same sudden gust. Judge Chen didn't move at first. Then, in a stuttering motion, he stood. His jaw tightened, his brow twitched. This is highly irregular, he barked, trying to reassert control. This is my courtroom. This is still my docket. But his voice cracked on the last word. It sounded less like a gavel and more like glass. His fingers reached for the wooden mallet, but they hovered, never gripping it fully. The weight of the moment was already too heavy. JD didn't look up. He remained seated at counsel's table, his pen moving across the yellow legal pad in slow, steady strokes. Not dramatic, not performative, just writing. As though all of this was expected. As though this was simply the next page in a script he had already memorized. Across the aisle, Chen's bailiff gave him a glance that wasn't quite defiant, but it wasn't deferential either. Even that small erosion of loyalty didn't go unnoticed. Judge Chen exhaled hard through his nose, as if trying to inhale authority and exhale disruption. Then he announced, "This court will enter a short recess. 15 minutes. Counsel, remain available." He struck the gavel, but it didn't echo like before. It thudded, dull and anticlimactic. The courtroom didn't scatter. No one rushed to the restroom or checked their phones. Instead, a low murmur swelled like a tide rising against a seawall. A few jurors leaned toward one another with cautious, whispered questions. Reporters stepped back from their notepads, unsure whether to leave the room or witness what came next. Eyes, so many eyes, turned not to the bench, but to JD. Still, he didn't speak. Still, he wrote. It was his stillness that filled the room, not the judge's voice, his patience that set the pace. The DOJ official didn't leave either. She simply took her seat again, folding her blazer neatly as if preparing to stay a while. Her posture was not casual but resolved, like someone who had just dropped an anchor and had no plans to pull it up. JD underlined something once, then closed the notepad and folded his hands. Finally, he looked up, not at Chen, but toward the gallery, just briefly, just enough for anyone watching to feel it. This wasn't about one man in a robe. It was about the rot that hides inside systems, the mold behind the marble, and now finally the air was beginning to clear. The gavel dropped once again, this time not with conviction, but caution. When Judge Chen returned from recess, something was missing from his posture. The swagger had evaporated, his robe still hung heavy over his shoulders, but his voice had lost its weight. "Counsel," he said, barely louder than a cough, "you may proceed." J.D. Vance stood slowly, his face unreadable. His eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on the DOJ official now seated in the corner like a quiet sentry. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. "Your Honor," J.D. began, "we respectfully request to enter into evidence an audiovisual exhibit, time-stamped, authenticated, and sourced legally under surveillance authorization, granted in a parallel investigation." He didn't say who authorized it. He didn't need to. The words were measured, but the courtroom felt them like the chill of a door opening in winter. A ripple moved through the jury box as JD's assistant approached the bench with a sealed folder and a small flash drive, handling both as if they were radioactive. Judge Chen adjusted his glasses, but his hand trembled as he did. He tried to speak but cleared his throat instead. He nodded wordlessly. The bailiff accepted the drive and plugged it into the court's display monitor. JD remained standing. His tone was steady, not accusatory, but what played on the screen didn't need embellishment. The video opened with muted colors, a timestamp in the corner. Early morning, a conference room with high windows and the sheen of luxury. Seated at the table was Judge Edward Chen, unmistakably him, in a blue tailored suit. Across from him sat a silver-haired man in a Gulfstream Industries lapel pin. The name placard was visible for only a moment. Thomas Wexley, CEO. The audio was clear, too clear. "What we need, Ed," the CEO was saying, "is not just a dismissal. We need a tone from the bench, something that'll discourage copycat suits, something cold." Judge Chen nodded, sipped from a coffee mug. "You'll have it. I know how to make certain arguments seem legally hollow without drawing too much attention." "And the ruling?" Wexley asked. "I'll phrase it as a lack of standing. It'll die quietly." JD didn't speak. No one did. The courtroom had become a vacuum. The video continued. They laughed. They exchanged pleasantries. They discussed rounds of golf. And in the final seconds, Judge Chen made a passing joke that landed like a guillotine in the courtroom. "Justice, my friend," he said with a smirk, "is just a matter of choreography." The screen went black. No dramatic music. Just silence. Real, thick, living silence. JD turned to the judge. "No further narration required, Your Honor. The footage speaks plainly." Chen didn't respond. His face had turned the color of ash. One hand gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white, the skin taut. A cough caught in his throat and he covered it with his sleeve, though it wasn't illness. It was exposure. He tried to lift the gavel, but it wobbled in his grip. This time he didn't strike it. He simply placed it down, gently, as if afraid of the sound. The jurors sat upright now, some squinting in disbelief, others staring blankly, frozen between comprehension and recoil. The courtroom gallery leaned forward in a synchronized hush. JD didn't sit down. He remained standing. Because this wasn't a closing argument. This was just the turn. The screen faded to black, but the room didn't move. No one whispered. No one shuffled. Not even the stenographer's fingers touched her keys. JD let the silence stretch a second longer, then clicked his pen. A soft sound, but in the stillness, it cracked like thunder. He opened a thick, navy blue folder. The DOJ official straightened in her seat. The FBI agents in the gallery didn't move, but their posture changed. Shoulders square, eyes sharp. "This court," JD began, "has long been a house of mirrors. Today we walk behind them. He walked toward the evidence table, lifting a thin manila envelope, holding it between two fingers as though it carried rot. Your Honor, I submit into evidence financial records subpoenaed from the Bank of the Caymans. These include wire transfers routed through shell companies within 48 hours of 5 separate rulings issued by this bench, all of which benefited Gulfstream Industries or its affiliates. Gasps were no longer hidden. They rang openly now, murmurs, stifled curses. The jurors leaned forward as the bailiff passed the documents up. J.D. continued without looking at Chen. The funds, J.D. went on, voice never rising, were deposited into 3 accounts under the alias E.J. Carpenter. The email associated with those accounts? edward.chen1951@protonmail.com. Judge Chen tried to speak. His lips parted, but no words came. Only a faint rasp, like the whisper of a drowning man. J.D. didn't wait for a reaction. He pulled out another folder, thicker, more worn. Here are digital contracts for speaking engagements booked through a consulting firm registered in the Bahamas, each one tied to companies with active litigation in this courtroom. Payments wired within days of rulings, often masked as travel reimbursements. The documents began making their way down the chain. Bailiff to clerk, clerk to bench, bench to judges' quaking hands. Reporters tapped frantically now. One of them stood and whispered into a recorder. Another typed with trembling fingers, mouthing the words as she wrote them. Judicial bribery confirmed. Timeline cross-referenced. Breaking now. Still, J.D. remained calm. Let's be clear, he said, stepping back. I didn't come here to prosecute. I came to protect this court from itself. That line hung in the air. Clean, sorrowful, surgical. In the back, one of the FBI agents touched a button on his earpiece. A second agent placed a hand just inside his jacket. No one had drawn a weapon, but something in the room had shifted. A current, a change in gravitational force. J.D. walked back to his table. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't even look angry. He looked like someone who had waited too long to be heard and now regretted having to speak at all. Judge Chen stared at the folder in front of him, but didn't open it. His eyes were wet, not tears. Sweat. He glanced at the jurors, then flinched. One of them, an older woman with silver hair, looked back at him with open disgust. Another juror whispered something into his neighbor's ear. The courtroom was no longer his. J.D. sat down finally. He placed his yellow legal pad flat in front of him and clicked his pen closed. Your Honor, he said softly, the people rest, for now. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning, and it was only the beginning. The silence after J.D.'s final words wasn't the hush of order. It was the vacuum left behind when illusions collapse. Judge Chen hadn't touched the evidence. His fingers hovered above the files, as though the pages might burn. But fire was already spreading, just not the kind you could see. The DOJ official rose slowly, stepping forward with the kind of calm that filled courtrooms only when the outcome had already been decided. Your Honor, she said, voice flat but final, by authority granted to the Department of Justice's Office of Judicial Integrity, I am formally submitting a motion for emergency suspension, effective immediately. A low wave of gasps crested through the room. Even the court reporter blinked hard before catching herself. Chen's mouth twitched. He looked down at the folder, then back at her. I deserve to respond, he stammered, to be heard. But even as he spoke, his voice shrank under the weight of everything that had come before. He wasn't a man defending his legacy. He was one trying to remember it. J.D. watched in silence, and then something shifted. Not in the room, but in the air. Images began flashing through J.D.'s mind, uninvited. A teenage boy in an orange jumpsuit, eyes wide with disbelief as a gavel sentenced him to 20 years for a crime he didn't commit. A mother weeping outside this very courthouse, clutching a torn manila folder of evidence no one would read. A father who sold his truck to afford an appeal that was never granted. They weren't ghosts. They were living casualties of a system made rigged, by rulings, by delays, by Chen, and now the system was remembering them. Your Honor, the DOJ official repeated, holding out the suspension papers, please surrender your docket key and security pass. Effective immediately, You are relieved of judicial duty pending formal review. Chen hesitated. The bailiff stepped forward. The moment hung. Then slowly, reluctantly, Judge Chen removed the black lanyard from his neck. The metal keycard clinked softly as it hit the clerk's desk. His shoulders dropped, not with peace, but with weight. I built this court, he muttered, barely audible. JD didn't reply. The time for arguments was over. Per federal procedure, the DOJ official continued, all physical evidence in this courtroom is to be secured until integrity protocols are complete. The bailiff nodded and approached the wheeled cart containing JD's binder, the folders, and the sealed USBs. With a metallic snap, he locked the lid and applied an evidence chain. One final click, the sound of justice anchoring itself. Reporters scrambled to file early headlines. Jurors whispered, their eyes still trained on Chen, no longer with fear, but with quiet judgment. The gallery no longer watched the trial. It watched the undoing. JD sat still. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply closed his pen, placed his pad down, and looked at the bench. Not with victory, but with sorrow. Because every ripple had a source, and now the tide was coming back in. By the time the court reconvened, the public had arrived. Not just in the gallery, but in headlines, camera lenses, and whispered calls to satellite vans double-parked outside. The name Judge Chen was no longer spoken with authority. It was spoken with disbelief, and soon with disgust. Reporters filled every corner of the chamber, standing too deep against the back wall. A sketch artist abandoned charcoal mid-stroke to begin fresh. Even the clerk seemed unsure how to breathe. JD entered quietly. No grand gesture, no sudden turn to the cameras. Just the methodical shuffle of papers, the calm stacking of legal exhibits, and the silent nod to his co-counsel. He didn't need the room to look at him. He only needed the record to hold what came next. He didn't stand, didn't gloat. He simply watched as the man who had ridiculed, undermined, and manipulated the very meaning of justice now found himself on the receiving end of its slow, exacting machinery. Chen, to his credit, didn't struggle. But as the marshals took his arms, more a formality than a restraint, his shoulders sagged, and for the first time, the room could see the weight he'd been carrying, or hiding. As they escorted him past the jury box, one juror turned her face away. As they passed JD, their eyes met. Briefly. JD gave no expression, no nod, no satisfaction, only silence. Because this wasn't a victory, it was an autopsy. Chen disappeared behind the same door he'd tried to escape through just moments earlier, only now as a detainee. The presiding judge, after a long pause, cleared his throat. This court will recess until further notice. And just like that, the room exhaled. JD finally stood, not for drama, but because it was time. He gathered his files with care. He glanced once toward the press row, where camera flashes had already begun anew. But he said nothing. He didn't need to. The system had spoken, and this time, it had done so in real time. The door Judge Chen disappeared through closed with a mechanical finality, its latch echoing faintly in the marble chamber. And just like that, the illusion shattered. Authority, once worn like a robe, now reduced to a pair of stainless steel cuffs and a file of criminal charges. Outside, the media swarm had already tripled. What began as court coverage had evolved into something far greater. Live feeds lit up television screens from D.C. to Des Moines. Headlines changed mid-scroll. Federal judge detained in open courtroom. Historic indictment signals, DOJ crackdown. Chen falls. What next for the judiciary? Inside, the courtroom emptied slowly. Jurors were quietly ushered out the side door, some pale-faced, others whispering to one another in disbelief. The reporters stayed, fingers flying, and in the middle of it all stood J.D. Vance, still and composed amid the frenzy. A dozen camera flashes fired at once when he moved, not toward the bench, but toward the gallery, where his co-counsel waited with a quiet nod. He didn't bask, didn't wave. The spotlight found him, but he didn't chase it. J.D.'s face, caught in dozens of photographs, stoic, almost unreadable, would become one of the most circulated images in legal history within hours. Not because he smiled or triumphed, but because he didn't. Down the hall, the Department of Justice's press podium had been hastily erected. The seal behind it still bore the rainwater streaks from transport. A woman in a navy blazer with silver DOJ credentials stepped up to the mic. Her voice was measured, firm. Today's events mark the beginning of a necessary reckoning, she began. The Department of Justice is formally launching a 5-year judicial integrity review, encompassing every district and circuit where rulings may have been tainted by undue influence or undisclosed conflicts of interest. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. There will be resistance. There will be discomfort. But there will also be truth. Justice demands it. Across the country, living rooms and break rooms and classrooms sat in rapt silence. Federal judges rarely fall. Federal judges are not escorted out like fugitives. And yet here it was, undeniable. Back inside the courtroom, J.D. remained for a moment longer. The bailiff approached him quietly. "Sir, do you need a security escort out?" J.D. shook his head gently. "No, I walked in alone. I'll walk out the same." He exited through the front, no back doors, no private hallways. Every eye followed. Someone whispered, "He just changed the face of judicial power in this country." But J.D. wasn't listening for praise. His mind was already 10 steps ahead. There would be appeals, investigations. People who had been wrongfully sentenced under Chen's rulings would now come forward. His job wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. Outside, the skies had darkened. Thunder rumbled low across the city, as though the weather, too, recognized the seismic shift beneath the marble and precedent. And somewhere, in a government office, a new file was opened. Not just on Chen, but on the system that enabled him. History would remember this day not as the fall of one man, but as the moment an institution was forced to look itself in the mirror. And in that mirror, for the first time in a long time, justice blinked and chose to stay awake. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady but heavy with purpose, "I move to submit 17 case files previously presided over by the Honorable Chen. Each contains material evidence suggesting judicial misconduct, including pattern rulings aligned with undisclosed financial interests." No one interrupted him this time. One by one, J.D. placed manila folders on the bench, each labeled, each real. The names weren't famous. They didn't have lobbyists or PACs. They had paper trails and pain. Case 1, Anthony Green. Sentenced 18 years after exculpatory evidence was suppressed. Case 2, Sheila Monroe. Civil ruling reversed after a judge's personal vacation was funded by the opposing firm. Case 3, Malik Turner. Denied retrial despite forensic inconsistencies, 4 of which were now confirmed as lab fraud. By the time J.D. opened the 12th folder, the jurors no longer looked at the bench. They looked inward. One older woman clutched a tissue in her lap. Another, seated near the end, began to cry. Not loud, not performative, just the slow, exhausted tears of someone who realized justice wasn't blind. It had been blinded, deliberately. "This isn't about revenge," J.D. said softly, breaking the quiet. "It's about repair. These aren't just names in court filings. They're people who were buried alive in paper." He turned to face the gallery for the first time, and the bench they trusted didn't just fail them. It sold them out. Click. Click. Cameras fired in bursts now. A reporter whispered near the door, "This is bigger than Watergate for the judiciary." The judge presiding now, a temporary appointment from the appellate circuit, said nothing. He simply nodded for J.D. to proceed. But J.D. paused. There was a rhythm in the room now, not of proceedings, but of reckoning. It hummed in the floorboards, pressed against the walls, bounced between the microphones. Every page turned was a knock on a long-ignored door. One reporter leaned to another. "This'll blow the lid off more than just Chen," she muttered. "This could shake confidence in half the circuit." J.D. heard it. He let it sit, because that was the point. Not just to expose a man, but to challenge a culture. He turned back to the bench, hands folded. "These are only the first 17, he said. "More will follow, because if the court is to heal, it must first acknowledge the wounds." Outside, a bell tolled in a nearby church tower. Inside, the sound that followed was quieter still, the slow, collective exhale of a courtroom beginning to confront itself. The courtroom, already thick with tension, shifted once more, this time to something colder. calculated. A new presence entered the space, not through the main doors, but from a side hallway seldom used. Two U.S. Marshals, plainclothes but unmistakable. The first held a black tablet, its screen still glowing. The second carried a sealed envelope, unmarked except for the Department of Justice emblem, in faded gold at the corner. They didn't speak to the judge. Not yet. Judge Chen had noticed them. Of course he had. But instead of acknowledging their presence, he merely leaned forward at the bench and gathered his notes. Slowly, methodically, almost casually. JD saw it from his seat, a deliberate choreography of denial. He's going to try to walk. Chen stood. No gavel strike. No motion for recess. Just a rustle of robes and a turn toward the side door that led to his chambers. For a split second, the gallery held its breath. Could a federal judge really just disappear? But the marshals moved as one. The taller of the two stepped directly into the narrow exit path, raising the tablet with a flick of the wrist. "Judge Henry Chen," he said, voice neutral but clear enough to cut glass. "You are the subject of a sealed federal indictment." Chen paused mid-stride. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again. The quiet courtroom felt suddenly cavernous. "For what?" he asked, voice dry. The marshal didn't blink. "Wire fraud, obstruction, abuse of judicial office, 21 counts pending unsealed confirmation." The second marshal stepped forward and handed him the envelope. "This is a certified notification of the charges. We're placing you in temporary detention pending a hearing before the Fifth Circuit's disciplinary panel." Chen tried to recover. "You can't be serious. This is a misunderstanding. A political hit job. You'll have counsel," the marshal interrupted, "but you will not leave this room." The courtroom didn't erupt. It inhaled. There were no gasps, just the muffled sound of phones vibrating in reporters' laps, of news alerts going live in real time. A staffer in the third row held up her phone to record, but was gently asked to lower it by court security. And through it all, J.D. Vance remained seated. Outside the courthouse, a media cyclone spun in full force. Cameras jostled for space on the barricades. Anchors shouted into microphones while their producers fed them updates through earpieces. Helicopters hovered above, circling like vultures, unsure whether the prey had fallen for good. The air was thick with headlines before they were even written. Inside, though, was a different world entirely. The courtroom now sat dim, emptied of gallery and noise, the tension replaced by a quiet that wasn't peace. It was the silence that comes only after a tremor, the kind that makes you question whether the aftershock is still on its way. In a small conference room down the hall, JD sat across from his legal team. Not speaking, not texting, just still. The team didn't push. Some took notes, some checked their watches, but no one spoke unless it was necessary. Even the clink of a spoon against a coffee mug felt like a violation. JD's chair creaked slightly as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He had declined every interview. CNN had called. So had 60 Minutes, the New York Times, and someone claiming to represent a documentary team from London. He answered none of them. He wasn't here for that. He never had been. His mind wandered. Quietly at first, then like a flood bursting through a cracked dam. Back 7 years. Back to a courtroom in rural Ohio. The benches were worn, the walls yellowed with time, and the fluorescent lights buzzed with apathy. His cousin, Marcus, had stood shackled before the bench, accused of assault in a bar fight he hadn't started, let alone finished. The case was thin, the evidence thinner. But Judge Chen had flown in as part of a judicial rotation, a program meant to clear rural court backlogs. What he'd done instead was bulldoze through Marcus's defense, interrupt witnesses, override objections, and issue a maximum sentence without flinching. "Let this be a warning to others," Chen had declared from the bench, the words burning like acid into JD's memory. Marcus had served 4 years before an appellate judge quietly reduced his sentence and ordered his release. No apology, no media, no correction to the record. Just freedom, delayed and tainted. JD hadn't been a federal attorney then, just a state prosecutor with a chip on his shoulder and too much to prove. But that day had marked him. Not in the way trauma brands the weak, but in the way a blade is forged, heated, hammered, cooled, then sharpened again. This case, the one that just cracked open the judiciary, was never about ambition for JD. It wasn't about headlines or legacy or political positioning. It was about Marcus, and about the thousands of other Marcuses whose names he didn't yet know, and now might finally have a chance to meet. A knock at the door pulled JD from the past. It was his assistant, Claire, holding a folder. Request from the DOJ. They want you to brief their task force. Tomorrow morning. JD nodded without taking the file. Tell them I'll be there. He stood slowly, smoothing his jacket, and looked at the legal pad he'd carried through every hearing. The last thing he'd scribbled on it was still legible. Justice is not a performance. It's a repair. And the real work of repair, he knew, was only just beginning. Behind the stately doors of a Department of Justice conference room, just 5 blocks from the courthouse, the true storm began to organize. The courtroom spectacle was over, but now came something far more dangerous: the institutional response. This wasn't about handcuffs or headlines anymore. This was about containment, about survival, and for a few, about redemption. Around the table sat officials from the DOJ's Public Integrity Section, senior FBI liaison, and JD's legal team. Each brought their own files, laptops, and a quiet urgency that bordered on dread. This wasn't the time for ceremony, not after what America had just seen. A DOJ official, mid-50s, seasoned, in a plain gray suit, was the first to speak. Judge Chen is only the beginning. His rulings, his influence, he was a keystone. Pull him out, and the whole arch above him starts to crack. JD nodded. He wasn't here to gloat. We need a coordinated review. Start with his sentencing records, case overlaps, financial disclosures. Build outward. The FBI agent next to him, a woman with sharp eyes and sleeves rolled up, added, We've already secured his devices, but I want your list of corporations linked to his offshore transfers. If we move fast, we can catch some of the money before it vanishes. Already in your inbox, JD said, sliding a drive across the table. That list is just the surface. The real rot sits deeper. Judges who normalized it, lawyers who folded instead of fighting, politicians who pretended not to see. Silence fell over the room. Not awkward, but heavy. Claire, JD's assistant, had been standing near the door. She finally broke the stillness. You knew this would happen. JD didn't answer immediately. He reached for a legal pad, opened it, then closed it again. He met her gaze, calm and steady. I didn't know if we'd win. I knew we couldn't stay silent. Claire looked down, absorbing that. JD had never been one for dramatics. If he said silence wasn't an option, then something in his bones had believed that justice, even wounded, could still rise if given a voice. The DOJ official cleared his throat. We're activating an emergency judicial audit protocol. You and your team will have top-level clearance. Expect resistance. If what you've exposed today expands the way we think it will, there will be backlash from judges, from donors, even from our own ranks. Good, JD said, eyes still fixed forward. That means it's real. More agents entered the room with fresh folders, tablets, and a map dotted with red pins. Districts where Chen had traveled, cases he'd influenced beyond his courtroom. JD watched it unfold like a grim mural. And still, not once did he smile. This wasn't victory. This was excavation, the beginning of the long, painful dig. As the meeting wore on, the room began to feel less like a task force and more like a war room. Names were named: judges, firms, elected officials. Systems weren't just being questioned, they were being documented for potential dismantling. Before leaving, JD stood to speak. His voice was low, but it carried. The law doesn't fail because bad people touch it. It fails because good people look away when they do. We stopped looking away. Today, no one applauded. No one needed to. Outside, the city pulsed with confusion and wonder. The press tried to guess what came next. But inside that room, behind closed doors, a different kind of truth was gathering force. And JD Vance, once silent, once underestimated, had just become the man every institution now had to reckon with. The corridors were empty now. The marble floors of the federal building reflected only the dim lights above. and JD's footsteps were the only sound that dared echo after midnight. His team had gone home hours ago, some collapsing from exhaustion, others retreating to catch the news cycles spinning out of control. But JD remained, where he always found himself when the storm passed, alone, behind a locked office door, surrounded by case files and silence. He loosened his tie and sat by the window, the city lights beyond the glass flickering like distant stars. In the corner of the room, his briefcase leaned against a chair, still half unzipped, stuffed with the aftermath of what they had just done. And yet tonight, it wasn't today's chaos that occupied his thoughts. His mind drifted, uninvited, back to a dusty classroom at UVA Law, second year, the day his ethics professor posed a question that silenced the room. What will you do when the system you serve asks you to look away? Back then, JD hadn't answered. He didn't need to. The answer was already forming itself in the quiet hours he spent poring over precedents, shadowing public defenders, and watching the way courtroom ceilings seemed lower in poor counties. That answer had followed him into the Marines, where he learned that silence in the face of injustice wasn't just complicity, it was violence. And later, when he came home, it followed him into every town hall where a grieving mother asked, "Do you think my son deserved 20 years for a first offense?" Tonight, those memories didn't make him proud. They made him ache. His office phone blinked with a single voicemail. JD leaned forward, pressed play. A woman's voice filled the quiet. Her tone was soft, southern, the kind of cadence you carry after generations of not being heard. "Mr. Vance, I don't know if you'll even listen to this, but I had to try. My son, Devin Thomas, you probably don't remember the case, but we just got word he's being released next week. 7 years. 7 years we thought were gone. And then, whatever it was you did, it gave us a second chance." There was a pause, a breath. "I don't know what you lost to do what you did, but I heard you. I watched every second. And what got me wasn't what you said, it's what you didn't. You didn't make it about you. You didn't just speak. You listened. Thank you. From a mother who never thought this day would come." The line clicked. Silence returned. JD closed his eyes. For a moment, everything blurred. His sense of time, of pain, of victory. This wasn't about bringing down a judge anymore. It never really had been. It was about every Devin Thomas. Every mother who prayed for someone to listen. Every lawyer who feared a career more than a conscience. Every court that forgot the scales were meant to balance, not tilt. He stood slowly, walked to his desk, and flipped open the legal pad still marked with scrawls from today's meeting. On the last page, beneath his final bullet point, he wrote a single line. "We don't stand because it's easy. We stand because someone must." He didn't know who would read it. He didn't care. He turned off the lights and left the office. The city waited, and so did tomorrow. When JD Vance returned to Capitol Hill, he wasn't greeted by silence, but he wished he had been. Senators lined up like spectators after a boxing match. They slapped his shoulder, called him a patriot, and whispered praise masked as politics. "You just gave us the playbook," one said. Another grinned. "You brought down a federal judge and didn't break a sweat." But JD wasn't smiling. His eyes looked past them all, fixed on something they couldn't see. He sat alone for a long while before requesting time on the Senate floor. The gavel echoed once, then twice. The chamber quieted. He stepped forward, not with a victory speech, but with something raw. "This wasn't about bringing down a man," JD began, his voice tired but grounded. "It was about bringing back belief in our laws, our courts, in the idea that justice isn't just a word but a bond, something sacred." He paused and looked up, not at the senators, but at the overhead lights. A courtroom is not a stage, and a robe is not a crown. We've allowed both to blur, and people, good people, have paid for our silence. The air grew heavy. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but JD pressed on. "There are names you'll never hear on this floor, families who never made the news, kids who stopped believing the system even knew their names. I didn't come here to be their hero. I came because I couldn't bear being part of their betrayal. The cameras captured it all. No theatrics, no script, just a man speaking without armor. C-SPAN didn't cut away once, By nightfall, his words had exploded across social media. The headline everywhere. It was about saving faith. But JD had already turned off his phone. 3 days later, JD stood in the quiet of his office, holding a letter he'd written a dozen times in his head before putting pen to paper. The envelope was simple. No title, no return address, just a name, Judge Harold Chen, and a correctional facility address that still didn't feel real. Inside, the letter was only 4 sentences long. You once told a courtroom that justice was about outcomes. I disagreed then. I disagree now. I hope you find clarity in what you denied others. There's still time, Harold. He sealed the envelope without rereading it and handed it to his assistant to post. Then he quietly slipped away, heading somewhere no camera followed. 2 hours south, the Appalachian Hills rolled beneath an open sky. JD parked outside a 1-story community center next to a shuttered courthouse in a town where justice had once been a formality. He hadn't been back since the day his cousin Micah was sentenced, wrongly as it turned out, to 7 years for a crime he hadn't committed. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and new hope. Volunteers from the Legal Reform Network were setting up laptops, copying flyers, mapping out outreach plans. JD walked straight to the back, where an older woman looked up from a desk. She recognized him immediately and stood. "You're really here," she said. "I promised Micah I would be," JD replied softly. She nodded toward a stack of folders. "These are the next ones we're reviewing. People who never got a fair look." He rolled up his sleeves without another word. By nightfall, he was cross-referencing arrest records against missing transcripts. Not as a senator, not as a headline. Just as a man undoing knots he didn't tie, but refused to ignore. The call came on a Thursday morning. The Department of Justice had reviewed JD's record, his argumentation, and his unprecedented exposure of systemic failure. They wanted him to consider a federal judgeship. "You'd be an asset to the bench," the official said. "Your integrity could reshape trust." JD didn't hesitate. "No," he said. Then more gently, "Justice doesn't need my name on a plaque. It needs people who don't flinch when it's ugly. People who aren't afraid to speak even when they stand alone." There was a long silence on the other end. Then the caller said, "Understood." That night, JD walked alone down the marble steps of the very courthouse where it had all unfolded. No security detail, no press scrum. The doors behind him slowly closed, not slammed, just finished with him for now. He paused halfway down. The night was cold and quiet. The city lights reflected in puddles on the stone. A breeze carried fragments of voices from across the plaza. A family leaving another court hearing. A protester explaining to a child why they held a sign. He didn't smile, but something in his shoulders softened. As he stepped off the final stair, a voiceover would later narrate the moment in a documentary watched by millions. "When the powerful forget who justice serves, the people remember." JD didn't turn to face the camera. He didn't need to. This ending wasn't about him. It never had been. This story reminds us that justice is not a title. It's a choice, made every day by those who dare to speak when silence feels safer. JD didn't fight for applause. He fought for truth, even when it meant standing alone. His journey shows that courage often wears quiet shoes, and that real change begins when we believe that ordinary people can confront extraordinary power. In the end, it wasn't about winning. It was about restoring trust. What about you? Have you ever stood up for what was right, even when no one else did? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.